The briefing notes are requested. Are they ready?
I'm on it, sir. Give me 2 minutes.
The turbulence began as nothing. A barely there shudder, the kind of thing you feel in your back teeth and immediately dismiss. The ordinary complaint of a plane moving through imperfect air. Leora Voss kept her eyes on the documents open across her lap, the columns of figures and redacted names that constituted her entire world at 37,000 feet. A small, ordered island in the immaculate cabin of Yoon Si-hyok's private jet. His jet. Everything, always, was his. She could feel him without looking. That was the particular discomfort of working for this man. He didn't need to move to occupy a room. Yoon Si-hyok sat across the aisle with the absolute stillness of someone who had long ago decided that stillness was its own form of power. No fidetin. No small talk. No tells. He was simply present in the way that dangerous things are present. Total, unhurried, and faintly threatening, the way a held blade is threatening even when no one is moving. The air around him carried the clean mineral scent of expensive restraint. Dark suit, immaculate. Eyes forward. Face unreadable, as always. As ever. She looked back at her documents. Then the shudder changed. It wasn't turbulence anymore. It was something angrier, a violent lateral jolt that snapped Leora sideways against her seatbelt hard enough to knock the breath from her chest. The documents scattered. Her water bottle hit the floor and rolled. Her head came up. Across the aisle, Yoon Si-hyok had not moved. But his hands, those still, controlled, always deliberate hands, were gripping the armrests. White at the knuckles. It was the first unguarded thing she had ever seen him do. A sound began. Low. Structural. It came from somewhere deep in the body of the aircraft. A groan that was not mechanical but almost organic, the sound of something enduring a pressure it was never designed to survive. And then one of the engines coughed. And went quiet. The silence where it had been was worse than any noise. Leora knew that silence. She had enough field experience to know that silence like that, sudden, total, in a place where sound is supposed to live, means something has gone wrong that cannot be taken back. The plane dropped. Not a dip. Not a correction. A drop. The floor simply ceasing to exist beneath her, her stomach launching into her throat, the horizon outside the window tilting from bleached blue sky into a blinding churn of burnt orange and pale sand rushing up impossibly fast. The Sahara. She could see the Sahara through the window, and it was not below them anymore, it was ahead of them, it was everywhere. The cabin detonated into chaos. The alarm was a physical thing, a shrieking assault that seemed to come from inside her own skull. Overhead compartments burst open. The world outside the window was spinning and wrong and too bright and too close. Leora's hands found the armrests and held on with everything she had, her mind, usually a precise and reliable instrument, reduced to a single white frequency of pure terror. This was not the kind of danger she had trained for. There was no protocol here. No exit strategy. No time. She looked across the aisle. Yoon Si-hyok was looking back at her. And the mask was gone. Not cracked, gone. The cold, controlled, impenetrable face she had spent 2 years learning to work around had simply ceased to exist, and in its place was something she had never once expected to find there, the same fear that was consuming her. Identical. Human. Raw in a way that his face had never been in any boardroom, any negotiation, any room where he held all the power and knew it. For one suspended, impossible second, they were just two people falling out of the sky together. Then the desert hit them. The impact was total, a concussive wall of force that slammed the air from her lungs and detonated through every bone in her body simultaneously. The sound of the fuselage tearing apart was everywhere at once, metal shredding, glass obliterating, the world collapsing inward at speed. There was a final enormous roar. Then silence. A different silence. Deep and ringing and absolute. Leora became aware of herself gradually, the throb behind her eyes, the copper taste filling her mouth, the smell of jet fuel sharp and chemical against something dry and ancient underneath it. Sand. She could smell sand. She blinked. Her vision swam, steadied, swam again. Twisted metal resolved itself above her. A jagged split in the fuselage framed a rectangle of desert sky, bleached white and merciless and vast. She was alive. The thought brought no relief. What it brought was a rush of cold clarity, an inventory completed in seconds. Body functional. Location unknown. Temperature already climbing. She needed to move. She needed to get out of the wreckage before the fuel found what it was looking for. Her seatbelt buckle clicked open like a gunshot in the dead air. She dragged herself toward the light, her ribs screaming, her hands finding purchase on torn metal and shredded upholstery, her legs pushing through the gap where the door had been until she collapsed onto the sand and the sand caught her and held her and the sun hit her face like a physical blow. She lay there for 3 seconds. Allowed herself 3 seconds. Then she lifted her head. A few meters away, half propped against the remains of the fuselage, was Yoon Si-hyuk. The suit was destroyed. There was blood at his temple, tracking a slow dark line down the side of his face and dripping from his jaw onto the sand below. His eyes were open. They found hers immediately, sharp, focused, already assessing, already working, and something passed between them that was not relief and was not warmth and was not anything she had a name for yet. Just the knowledge, shared and unspoken, of what they had survived. And the beginning of the much harder question, what came next? He spoke first. His voice was a rough, controlled rasp, quieter than usual, stripped of its usual authority but precise. "Can you walk?" Leora looked at him. At the blood. At the wreckage behind them. At the sand extending in every direction to a horizon that offered nothing. "Can you?" He almost didn't answer. Then, with an effort she could see and suspected he would never admit to, he pushed himself upright. They stood in the wreckage of his jet in the middle of the Sahara, two people who had never been anything to each other but adversaries, and looked at what the world had just handed them. There was no one else. No signal. No water visible in any direction. No sound except the tick of cooling metal and the low, dry whisper of the wind moving over an infinite expanse of sand. And the only person for miles was the man she had been absolutely certain, until approximately 4 minutes ago, that she could never trust. 2 years. That was how long Leora Voss had worked inside Yoon Si-hyuk's world without becoming part of it, which was, she had always believed, the only way to survive it. She had taken the position knowing exactly what it was. Head of operations for a logistics company whose books were clean, whose offices were glass and steel and aggressively legitimate, and whose founder had a reputation that moved through rooms 30 seconds before he did. She had taken it because the salary was exceptional, the work was genuinely complex, and because Leora Voss did not frighten easily. She had grown up in rooms where the wrong word cost something real. She knew how to read danger. She knew how to stay useful without becoming indebted, how to do excellent work for a man she did not respect without letting that absence of respect become a problem for either of them. She had managed it. Barely. Consistently. The contempt she kept below the surface, pressed flat and professional, visible to no one. It was not the organization that bothered her. She had made her peace with complicated money long before Yoon Si-hyuk. It was him. The way he moved through his own company like a system rather than a person. The way he looked at the people around him and calculated rather than connected. She had watched him end careers with the same expression he used to approve quarterly reports. Neutral, efficient, entirely unmoved. She had watched people who had given him years of loyalty walk out of his office with nothing but a severance figure and the particular hollowness of someone who has just learned they were never as significant as they believed. She had promised herself on the first day that she would never be one of them. She kept that promise by staying excellent and staying distant. By never needing anything from him that she could not supply herself. It had worked. Until the Sahara decided otherwise. The investigation would later determine that it was a catastrophic hydraulic failure, cascading, irreversible, the kind of event that happens less than once in a million flight hours and had, by some indifferent arithmetic of probability, chosen this aircraft, this route, this afternoon. The report would be thorough and precise and would explain everything except the part that mattered, which was what it felt like from inside when the second engine followed the first into silence and the nose of the plane began its final, committed descent toward 400 kilometers of empty desert. Leora remembered fragments. The documents leaving her hands. The horizon going vertical in the window. The extraordinary noise of the fuselage absorbing an impact it was not built to survive. And then the specific quality of the silence that followed, not peaceful, not relieving, but shocking. The silence of a world that has just stopped and is taking a moment to decide what comes next. She had pulled herself out through the gap in the fuselage, already cataloguing damage. Ribs, 2, possibly 3, compromised. Left wrist sprained, not broken. Laceration above the right eyebrow, bleeding efficiently but not alarmingly. She had touched the side of her head, examined her fingers, made the relevant calculations. Functional. She was functional. That was what mattered. The desert received her without ceremony. She hit the sand on her knees, stayed there for exactly 3 seconds, and then lifted her head. The wreckage was burning. Not explosively, a low, ugly, purposeful burn working its way through what remained of the rear section, sending a column of black smoke straight up into air so still it seemed solid. The smoke was the only good thing about their situation. Smoke could be seen. Whether anyone was positioned to see it was a separate question she set aside for later. Yoon was already on his feet by the time she found him. She didn't know how. The blood on his face had tracked down his neck and was darkening the collar of his destroyed shirt, and she had seen the way he'd been sitting at impact, thrown sideways and hard. But he was upright and he was scanning the perimeter with the systematic attention of someone running threat assessment, which under the circumstances was either impressive or simply what happened when control was the only mode a person had ever learned. He looked at her the way he always looked at her. Measuring. Direct. Giving nothing away. She looked back at him the way she always looked at him. Steady. Unrevealing. Giving nothing away. Around them, the desert extended in every direction to the same flat, indifferent horizon. No roads. No structures. No movement of any kind except the heat rising off the sand in slow visible waves. The temperature was already past 40 and climbing, the sun positioned with the particular cruelty of early afternoon in a place with no shade and no mercy. The wreckage held the bodies of a pilot and co-pilot who had not survived the cockpit. They were alone. Whatever came next, they were alone. Yoon broke the silence first. Not with anything reassuring. Not with a plan. Just 4 words, stated with the flat precision of someone identifying a problem before moving on to solutions. We need to move. Leora looked at the smoke. At the sand. At the man she had spent 2 years keeping carefully at arm's length, who was now, by the desert's complete indifference to her preferences, all she had. I know, she said. And they began. They moved west. Leora made the call without consulting him and he didn't argue, which she took not as agreement but as the tactical patience of a man who was waiting to see if she was right before deciding whether to have an opinion about it. The sun was tracking toward its peak and west kept it marginally out of their eyes. Small advantage. In a place like this, small advantages were the only kind available. She set the pace, measured, deliberate, nothing wasted. She had done a survival course 8 years ago in the Negev, 3 weeks that she had signed up for because the ability to function in hostile terrain seemed like the kind of thing a person in her line of work should know, and which had turned out to be the most relentlessly unglamorous experience of her life. Unglamorous and, as of this afternoon, worth every uncomfortable hour. We're looking for low ground, she said, without looking at him. Dry riverbeds. Vegetation lines. Anything that suggests water moves through here when it rains. When does it rain? Not often. She paused. But it does. He said nothing. She took that as acknowledgement and kept walking. What she didn't say was that she was already thirsty. Had been since she pulled herself out of the wreckage. The adrenaline had masked it for a while, but it was making itself known now with increasing insistence, and she knew enough to know that thirst in the desert was a lagging indicator. By the time you felt it, you were already behind. They had retrieved 2 items of value from the wreckage before the fire made further salvage impossible. A half-liter of water from a bottle that had survived the impact wedged under a seat, and a small emergency kit from a cabinet near the rear galley that contained a foil blanket, a lighter, and a flare. 1 flare. She was carrying both. He hadn't suggested otherwise. Yoon walked beside her without complaint, which she was monitoring more carefully than she let on. The wound on his temple had slowed but not stopped. He was moving with a slight compensation on his left side. Ribs, she suspected, same as hers. But his pace was steady and his breathing was controlled in a way that suggested either exceptional fitness or exceptional stubbornness or both. She had always assumed his physical discipline was aesthetic. A power choice, like the suits. Out here it was turning out to be something more functional. 40 minutes in, she saw it. A shallow depression in the terrain, barely perceptible, running at an angle to their path. The sand in it was a slightly different color. Not wet, nowhere near wet, but different. She angled toward it without explanation. "What are you doing?" His voice was even. Curious in the way that a person is curious when they're trying to determine if someone else knows something they don't. "See how the ground dips there? Water follows topography even when there's no surface flow. If anything survives subsurface in this region, it'll be in the low channels." She crouched, pressed her hand flat against the sand at the lowest point of the depression. "Slightly cooler. Slightly. We dig here." He looked at the ground. Looked at her. Then crouched beside her and started digging without another word, using his hands the same way she was using hers, moving sand with efficient scooping motions, going deeper. She was aware of how close he was. The heat coming off him, separate from the ambient heat of the desert, particular to him. She focused on the sand. 30 centimeters down, her fingers found moisture. Not water. Damp. But damp was everything. They dug wider, dug deeper, worked around the wet patch without disturbing it, and slowly enough that Leora held her breath through the whole process, a thin lens of dark water began to seep into the hollow they'd created. 1 inch. Maybe 2. Enough. She sat back on her heels and looked at it. "Don't drink straight away," she said, pulling the foil blanket from the kit and tearing a strip to use as a rough filter. "Let it settle. And drink slowly when you do." He watched her work the makeshift filter over the hollow without speaking. Then, "You've done this before." "Negev. 8 years ago." She handed him the filtered water first, in the bottle's cap, a small amount, carefully managed. "Field survival course." He took it. Drank it with the same measured control he seemed to apply to everything. Then he looked at her with an expression she couldn't immediately categorize. Not gratitude exactly, not the careful neutrality he wore in the office. Something in between. An adjustment. A recalibration happening behind his eyes. "I didn't know that," he said. "There are things about me you don't know." She took her own small measure of water and drank it slowly, feeling it move through her like something sacred. "You never asked." The silence that followed was different from the silences they had shared across boardroom tables and cabin aisles for 2 years. Those silences had been managed, constructed by mutual agreement to contain nothing. This one was less controlled. Something had been said that was true, and the truth of it was sitting between them in the desert heat, taking up space. Yoon said nothing. But he didn't look away. Leora capped the bottle, stood, and checked the sun. "We need to find shade before 2 o'clock, she said. "Then we move again after 4. She started walking. After a moment, she heard his footsteps behind her, steady, measured, keeping pace. The silence had not warmed. But it had changed. That, for now, was enough. They had made it back to the wreckage by 3 in the afternoon, which was the only decision Leora had made all day that she felt entirely good about. The fuselage had burned itself out in the hours they'd been moving. The rear section was gone, blackened and collapsed inward, but the forward cabin had survived more or less intact, which was luck of the structural kind, the passive variety that didn't ask anything of you except that you notice it and use it. She had noticed. She filed it under shelter and moved on. They had found a rocky overhang 40 minutes from the crash site during the worst of the midday heat. A shallow ledge of sandstone that offered 3 feet of shade and nothing else, and sat beneath it in silence for 2 hours while the desert did its worst overhead. Leora had used the time to inventory their position with the methodical attention she usually reserved for quarterly reports. 1 flare. 1 lighter. Less than half a liter of water remaining, carefully rationed. 2 people with compromised ribs, 1 with a head wound that needed cleaning, and no communication equipment that had survived the fire. She had gone through the numbers twice and arrived at the same answer both times. They needed rescue to come to them, which meant the smoke signal from this morning was already their best asset, already spent, already cooling somewhere in the atmosphere above the Sahara. She didn't share this calculation with Yoon. Not because she was protecting him from it. She suspected he had done the same arithmetic independently and reached the same conclusions, but because saying it out loud would cost something she wasn't ready to spend. They were back at the fuselage, assessing the interior for the night, when Leora looked west and stopped moving. The horizon had changed. It had been flat and pale all day, the particular bleached emptiness of deep desert, sky meeting sand in a line so clean it looked drawn. Now something was building along it. A darkness that wasn't weather in any conventional sense. A wall. Tan and brown and enormous, rising from the desert floor to somewhere in the upper atmosphere, moving toward them with the calm, total purpose of something that did not need to hurry because it could not be stopped. Haboob, she said. Her voice came out level. She was proud of that. We have maybe 2 minutes. Yoon looked at it once. That was all he needed. Inside. They moved fast. The forward cabin was accessible through the split in the fuselage she had crawled out of that morning, wider now that she examined it. Wide enough to get through quickly, narrow enough to block with the piece of interior paneling she had noted earlier leaning against the outer hull. She went in first, pulling the emergency kit and the water. He came through behind her and she handed him the paneling without discussion, and he wedged it across the gap with the efficiency of someone who had spent a lifetime solving physical problems under pressure. Not perfectly sealed, but close. The light changed. The quality of it shifted in the seconds before the wall hit, going amber, then ochre, then a dim sourceless brown, and then the sound arrived. Not gradually. All at once, the way serious things arrive. A roar that was not a single note but a frequency, the desert's entire atmosphere becoming percussion, the fuselage absorbing it and transmitting it through the floor and walls and into the bones of anyone inside. Then the sand came. It found every gap. Every join, every crack, every imperfect seal in their improvised barrier, thin streams of fine particulate pouring through in slow continuous lines, coating everything, the air inside thickening within seconds. Leora pulled her jacket over her mouth and nose. Yoon did the same with what remained of his shirt collar. It was dark. Not completely. Pale brown light filtered through the sand-frosted window above them, but close enough that detail disappeared and what remained was shape and proximity and sound. The fuselage was not large. It had not been large even when it was a functioning aircraft with defined spaces and designated distances. Now, compressed by necessity and the dark, it was small in a way that had nothing to do with its physical dimensions. She was aware of him with a completeness that the office and the boardroom and the cabin in its previous life had never permitted, the warmth coming off his body, the controlled steadiness of his breathing against the roar outside, his shoulder against hers where the space had decided that was simply where they both were. Neither of them moved to change it. The storm did not abate. It settled. There is a difference. Abating implies retreat, implies a decision to stop. This simply became the world outside, replacing it entirely, and inside the fuselage there was nothing to do but exist within it and wait and breathe and be precisely as close as the space required. At some point his breathing steadied into something that was almost deliberate, slowed, rhythmic, the breathing of a man imposing calm on his own nervous system by sheer force of training. She found herself matching it without deciding to. In. Out. The sand hissed against the hull. The world outside roared and was nothing. She didn't look at him. He didn't look at her. When it passed, an hour later or two, time having become approximate, the silence it left was immense and clean. The paneling had held. The air inside was thick with settled particles but breathable. They were intact. Leora moved first. Checked the seal, checked the kit, checked the water. Practical. Sequential. The things that needed doing. Yoon straightened beside her and said nothing about any of it. Neither did she. But in the careful inventory she kept of everything that mattered, she noted it. Filed it somewhere that wasn't professional and wasn't practical and had no label she was willing to apply yet. She noted it, and she moved on. Nobody warned you about the cold. That was the thing. The desert spent all day being merciless in one direction. Heat that pressed down on you like a physical weight, that pulled the moisture from your skin before you knew it was leaving, that turned the air above the sand into something visible and wavering and hostile. You spent the day negotiating with it, rationing yourself against it, surviving it by fractions. And then the sun dropped below the horizon and took everything with it. Every degree it had forced on you during the day, it reclaimed at night with interest. Within an hour of sunset, the temperature had fallen far enough that Leora's hands were stiff and the ground beneath her was conducting cold upward through the fuselage floor with quiet, remorseless efficiency. She had the foil blanket. She had her jacket. She had the particular kind of exhaustion that should have made sleep easy and instead made it architectural. Something she had to construct carefully, layer by layer, while her ribs reminded her of their condition every time she shifted position. She found the least uncomfortable configuration against the inner hull and stayed in it and closed her eyes and told herself that this was rest even if it wasn't sleep and that rest was sufficient and that she would be functional in the morning. She was nearly there when she heard him move. Not toward her. Toward the gap in the fuselage, the opening they'd resealed after the storm with the paneling propped rather than fixed, approachable from inside. She heard the scrape of metal, felt the cold air push in briefly, heard the soft compression of sand under a careful footstep. Then silence. She lay still and listened to the silence and understood what he was doing and said nothing. She slept. When she woke it was the deep cold of what she estimated as 2 or 3 in the morning, the darkest and most temperature-committed part of a desert night. The kind of cold that had moved past discomfort into something more serious, that she felt in her back teeth and at the base of her skull. She was awake all at once. The way field training had rewired her. No gradual surfacing, just present, alert, cataloging. She listened. Heard nothing threatening. Heard, after a moment of adjusting to the silence, the faint sound of controlled breathing just outside the gap. She got up. Picked up the piece of sharpened fuselage she had kept beside her, a length of aluminium she'd worked to a point that morning, not elegant but functional, and moved to the opening. Yoon was sitting with his back against the outer hull, facing out into the desert. He had his own piece of sharpened metal across his knees. His eyes were open and moving, a slow, systematic scan of the perimeter, left to right, pausing at intervals, returning. He was not watching nothing. He was watching everything, the way you watch when you have decided that watchfulness is the only thing standing between the people inside and whatever the dark might be considering. He didn't hear her come out. Or he heard her and identified her and decided she didn't require a reaction. With Yoon Si-hyuk she had never been entirely sure which of those it was. She sat down beside him without speaking. He glanced at her once, that brief, assessing look, and returned his eyes to the desert. The cold was significant out here. She could see the tension in his jaw, the slight set of his shoulders that was not his usual controlled stillness but the body's involuntary response to sustained low temperature. He had given her the foil blanket without discussion when they'd settled for the night. She had taken it without arguing because arguing would have been its own kind of statement and she wasn't ready to make it. Now she could see what that decision had cost him and the knowledge sat in her chest with a weight she didn't examine. She held out her hand for his piece of metal. He looked at it. Looked at her. Sleep, she said. One word. The same flat practicality he used when he wanted something done without discussion. Something moved at the edge of his expression. Not quite amusement. Not quite anything she had a name for. He handed over the metal without argument, which she suspected was the closest he knew how to come to thank you, and after a moment he leaned back against the hull and closed his eyes. She watched the desert. Left to right. Pause. Return. The sand was pale under a sky so dense with stars it seemed structural, load-bearing, holding something up. The cold worked its way through her jacket and she let it, stayed present inside it, kept her eyes moving. At some point she became aware that his breathing had changed, deepened, slowed, lost its careful architecture and become something unguarded. She glanced at him. His face in the starlight was different from his face in any light she had seen it in before. Stripped of its precision. Younger, maybe, or just more true, the face of a person rather than a position. She looked for longer than she needed to. Then she looked back at the desert, at the vast cold dark of it, and kept watch until the sky began, almost imperceptibly, to change. She did not think about why she had looked. She did not think about what it meant that she had not been able to stop. There would be time for not thinking about that later. Right now there was the perimeter, and the cold, and the slow patient arrival of the desert dawn. She stayed until the light came. She had not planned to. She stayed anyway. She noticed the wound properly on the morning of the third day. It had been there since the crash, a gash on his left forearm where something in the fuselage had opened the skin during impact, not deep enough to be immediately alarming, deep enough to need attention she hadn't been able to give it in the chaos of the first hours. She had noted it the way she noted everything, catalogued, filed, assigned a priority level below water and shelter and the more urgent laceration at his temple. He hadn't mentioned it. She hadn't expected him to. But on the third morning, when the light came up and she could see clearly again, she looked at his arm and the priority level changed. The edges of the wound had darkened. The skin around it was raised and warm. She could see the warmth even before she touched it, the particular flush that meant the body had identified a problem and was deploying everything it had to address it. In a hospital, it would be a manageable conversation. Out here, with no antibiotics, no clean water to spare, and a sun that was already climbing toward the kind of heat that accelerated everything in the wrong direction, it was the most serious problem they currently had. More serious than food. More serious than the flare they hadn't used yet and the question of when. "Let me see your arm," she said. He looked at her with the expression he used when he was deciding whether to comply with something or redirect it. "It's infected," she said, before he could make the decision. "I'm not asking." He extended his arm. She took it with both hands and examined the wound in the direct morning light, her fingers careful around the edges, reading the tissue the way the Negev course had taught her, what was salvageable, what wasn't, what needed to happen next. The news was not good, but it was not yet catastrophic, which meant there was a window and the window required immediate use. She had been collecting what she needed since the previous afternoon, when she'd first registered the change in the wound's color. Desert plants whose properties she'd read about years ago and had been quietly identifying since their first day of walking. A sparse gray-green succulent with antibiotic compounds in its sap, a dry crumbling bark she recognized from field notes she hadn't thought about in years but which lived, apparently, in the part of her memory that kept the things that mattered. She had said nothing about collecting them. She had simply collected them. She worked in silence, crushing the succulent against a flat piece of fuselage, applying the sap to the wound with the cleanest strip of fabric she could produce from the hem of her inner shirt. He watched her hands. She watched the wound. The proximity required for the work was simply a condition of the work, and she treated it as such. "This is going to draw and it's going to hurt," she said, pressing the poultice against the infected site and wrapping it firmly. "Tell me if the heat spreads past your elbow by this afternoon." "It won't. That's not how infection works." He said nothing. She tied off the bandage and didn't release his arm immediately, was checking the tension, checking the coverage, which required another few seconds of holding on, which she did with the same clinical focus she had applied to everything else. "How long have you been running the organization?" she asked. She hadn't planned the question. It arrived without consultation, the way questions do when the careful management of distance has been worn down by 3 days of surviving in close quarters. She expected silence. She expected the careful redirect he deployed in meetings when a question approached territory he'd decided was not available. She expected, at minimum, a pause long enough to constitute a small refusal. He said, "Since I was 19. She kept her hands moving, kept her eyes on the bandage. "My father died when I was 18, he said, in the same tone he might use to report a change in quarterly figures. Neutral. Factual. The voice of a man delivering information from behind very thick glass. There was no transition. No preparación. There were people who needed someone to be in charge, and I was the one they were looking at. A pause. You make the choices that are in front of you. After a while the choices stop feeling like choices." Leora's hands went still. She was aware of it, the stillness, and couldn't immediately correct it. 18 years old. She was running a calculation she hadn't asked to run, mapping the arithmetic of it, 19 when he took over, which meant the version of himself that existed before all of it, the version that might have had a different shape, had lasted precisely 18 years before the organization consumed it entirely. More than half his life ago. Long enough that the before was probably more memory than lived reality. Long enough that the mask had stopped being something he put on and become something he simply was. She had spent 2 years being certain about who he was. The certainty had been useful. It had been clean and functional and had made every interaction simple to navigate. It was not available to her anymore. She finished the bandage. Released his arm. Sat back with the careful, unhurried movement of someone who was not affected by what had just been said. Keep it out of the sand, she told him, her voice steady and practical and revealing nothing of the rearrangement happening quietly behind it. He nodded once. Neither of them said anything else. But something had been handed across in the space between his words and her silence, and they both knew it, and the desert held it between them in the warming morning air like something that could not now be taken back. They saw the camp on the 4th afternoon, from the top of a dune ridge that Leora had climbed to read the terrain ahead. She had been looking for the thing they needed, elevation, a vantage point from which to use the flare with some probability that someone worth signaling was positioned to see it. What she found instead, half a kilometer to the northeast, partially obscured by a natural rock formation that had been chosen for exactly that purpose, was something that made her go very still on the ridge and then come down the same way she'd gone up, carefully, below the sightline, back to where Yoon was waiting. Camp, she said, low. Northeast. 8 to 10 vehicles, covered. I counted at least 6 figures and there will be more inside. She paused. They're not military. The vehicles are civilian, modified. And they're positioned to avoid satellite sightlines. Yun's expression didn't change. But something behind it did, a shift in the quality of his attention, a focusing that she had learned over the past 4 days meant he was doing what he did when the situation became serious, which was think faster than the situation could develop. Smugglers, he said. Not a question. The infrastructure says yes. Could be goods. Could be worse. She looked at him steadily. People, most likely. This route, this kind of concealment. A silence. The kind that meant he agreed and was already past it. We go around, he said. Wide. South Arc, come back to our heading on the far side. We move after dark. She nodded. That was the right call. She had already reached it herself and was mildly annoyed that he'd said it first, which was a reaction so ordinary and so out of place in their current situation that she noted it as a sign that she was still functional enough to be petty, which she decided to take as a positive indicator. They waited out the remaining daylight in a shallow depression 60 meters south of the ridge, below the horizon of anyone watching from the camp. Yoon used the time to check the arm. She watched him do it, watched him assess the wound with the same methodical attention he applied to everything and register what she already knew, which was that the swelling had reduced slightly and the heat had not progressed. He said nothing about it. She said nothing about the fact that she'd been watching. They moved at full dark. The South Arc added time and distance they could not entirely afford, but the alternative was not available, so they moved through it efficiently, threading between rock formations, keeping their footfalls as quiet as the sand allowed. The night was clear and cold and the stars provided just enough light to navigate by if you knew how to use them, which Leora did. She set the pace. Yoon matched it without complaint. They were 3/4 of the way around the camp's perimeter. Close enough that she could see the glow of a gas lamp through the rock formation, could hear, faintly, the sound of voices in a language she didn't speak, when Yoon held up a hand. She stopped. Listened. A patrol. One figure, moving along the eastern edge of the camp's informal boundary, following a route that was not random, practiced, repeated, the patrol of someone doing a job they'd done enough times to be bored by it. Which made them dangerous in a particular way. Boredom sharpened the perception of anomaly. She and Yoon sank lower, moved laterally toward a cluster of boulders that offered cover, moving with the exaggerated care of people who understood that a single displaced stone could be the difference between invisible and found. She reached the boulders. Pressed in. Turned to confirm he was behind her. She looked back. He was still moving, had taken a slightly different angle to the rocks, 3 meters further out, and the patrol had changed its timing in the way patrols do when something has registered below the level of conscious thought but above the level of nothing. The figure was turning. Yoon saw it at the same moment she did and made the only calculation available. He was too exposed to reach cover before the turn completed, which meant cover was no longer the objective. He went still instead. Flat against the ground, motionless, relying on the dark and the distance and the patrol's inattention. It almost worked. A second figure she hadn't seen, positioned differently, watching a different angle, stepped out from behind the nearest vehicle and swept a torch beam across the ground in a long unhurried arc, the kind of sweep that wasn't looking for anything specific and therefore found things you'd specifically try to hide. The beam crossed Yun's position and stopped. What happened next was fast and practiced and completely final. Two more figures materialized from the camp's edge. Yoon was on his feet and he was not going quietly. She saw that, registered it with something that cut clean through her chest, but he was outnumbered and unarmed in any serious sense, and the desert did not provide good options for a man facing three armed figures in the open. Before they took him, he turned his head. Found her position in the dark with the accuracy of someone who had been tracking exactly where she was the entire time. His eyes met hers. No fear. No panique. Just one clear, direct, unambiguous look that said everything he would never say out loud. Stay hidden. Stay alive. Do not come after me. She was already planning before they disappeared into the camp. She gave herself 5 minutes to be afraid. It was a discipline she had developed years ago, not the suppression of fear, which was both impossible and counterproductive, but its containment. You acknowledged it, you gave it a fixed and limited amount of time, and then you set it aside and got to work. 5 minutes. She sat behind the boulders with her back against the cold rock and let the fear be fully present. The specific terror of being alone in the desert with no weapons and no backup, and the only other person who knew she existed currently in the hands of people who traded in human lives. She let it be real. She felt the full weight of it. Then she got up and began to study the camp. She worked her way around the full perimeter over the course of 2 hours, moving in slow, careful increments, never staying in one position long enough to become part of the background that a watching eye would notice if it changed. She counted figures, tracked movement patterns, identified the patrol routes and their intervals, located the vehicles and their positions relative to each other and to the rock formation at the camp's northern edge. She found the place where Yoon was being held, a covered vehicle near the center, guarded by one figure who rotated with another on what she timed as a 40-minute cycle. She noted the lamp positions and the dark spaces between them. She noted the direction of the faint wind that had started an hour after sunset, coming from the southwest, consistent with the thermal patterns she'd observed across 4 days of desert travel. She noted everything. Then she sat with it and built. What she had, one flare, one lighter, the desert's geography, and the specific vulnerability of people who didn't know the terrain they were operating in. What she needed, 3 minutes of chaos directed at the eastern side of the camp, one guard rotation at the vehicle, and the particular kind of darkness that follows when a light source is extinguished suddenly. She started with the dune. 200 meters northeast of the camp, a steep-faced dune had been slowly underpinned by wind into the particular unstable geometry that the Negev course had taught her to recognize. The face too steep for the grain size, the crest overhanging its own base by a margin that needed only the right disturbance to resolve. She had identified it during her circuit and had thought, maybe. Now she thought, yes. She spent 40 minutes moving sand at the dune's base. Not randomly, precisely, pulling material from the 2 points where the base was bearing the most load, working with the structure rather than against it, the way you'd remove keystones rather than walls. She had done something similar in training with a much smaller formation and significantly less at stake. Her arms burned. She kept working. Then she moved to the eastern edge of the camp and used the lighter on the driest brush she could find. Sparse low, the kind that caught fast and burned short, positioned it downwind of the camp's eastern lamps. Small. Enough to be seen. Enough to require investigation. Then she went back to the dune, took a breath, and used the flare. Not upward. Horizontal, into the dune's undermined base, a single sustained burst of heat and force delivered to the exact point she'd been working toward. The dune came down. Not catastrophically, there were no catastrophic dunes in this part of the terrain, but significantly, a rushing collapse of material that generated a sound entirely unlike anything else the desert produced, a deep concussive slide that moved through the ground as much as the air, accompanied by a cloud of sand that the wind picked up immediately and drove southeast across the camp's eastern side. The brush caught 2 seconds later. The camp's reaction was everything disorientation produces in people who are confident in their environment until they suddenly aren't. Voices, movement, the patrol braking pattern, figures converging on the east, the lamp nearest the eastern boundary knocked sideways by someone moving too fast and going out. The guard at Yun's vehicle turned toward the noise and then turned again as the brush fire added light and shadow in the wrong directions simultaneously, and then made the decision that people make when two things are happening and one of them is closer. He moved east. Leora was already moving. She crossed the dark center of the camp in 12 seconds, cut the fastening on the vehicle's rear cover with the piece of sharpened aluminium she'd carried since day one, and found him in the dark interior, hands bound, a cut above his eye that was new since she'd last seen him, upright and alert and staring at her with an expression she had never seen on his face in 2 years of working in the same building. She cut the binding. He was on his feet before the cord finished falling. They went out the western side into the dark, into the desert, moving fast and low and not speaking. Behind them, the camp was still resolving its confusion. She set a course by the stars and kept them moving for 40 minutes before the sound of the camp had gone entirely and the desert was just the desert again, cold and enormous and indifferent, the same as it always was. They stopped in the lee of a rock formation and she checked his arm and his face in the dim starlight and he let her and said nothing throughout. Then, you came back. His voice was not what she expected. Not the controlled neutral register he deployed for everything. Something underneath that. Something that had been stripped of its management somewhere in the hours since she'd last heard him speak. Don't make it strange, she said. He looked at her for a long moment in the dark. The expression on his face was the same one she hadn't been able to categorize at the dune. Not gratitude, not relief exactly, but something that had the weight and texture of both and was also something else entirely, something she was not ready to name in the middle of the desert at whatever hour of the night this was. She looked away first. Checked the stars. Reset their heading. We need to keep moving, she said. He fell into step beside her without a word. But the silence between them now had a different quality than any silence that had come before it. Something had been settled in it, or begun, or both at once. She kept her eyes on the stars and said nothing and walked on into the dark. They walked until the sky began to change. Not sunrise yet, the suggestion of it, the desert's version of a warning, the black overhead softening by degrees into something that was not quite color but was no longer nothing. Leora found a rock formation that offered cover on 3 sides and a clear sight line to the south, and she made the decision that they were done moving for now without consulting him, because her body had arrived at the end of something and she suspected his had too, and the desert ahead of them would still be the desert in 2 hours. She sat down with her back against the rock. He sat beside her. Not across from her, not at the managed professional distance that had governed every interaction for 2 years, beside her, the way they had existed in the fuselage during the storm and on the cold ground during the night watches, proximity having become in the last 4 days simply the default condition of their shared survival. For a while neither of them said anything. The adrenaline drained out slowly, the way it does, not all at once but in stages, leaving behind it a specific kind of exhaustion that was also a specific kind of clarity, the feeling of having been reduced to what was actually there. She was aware of the cut above his eye. New since the camp. She should clean it. She would, in a moment. She didn't move yet. They knew who I was, he said. She looked at him. Not immediately. But by the time you came. He was looking at the horizon, at the slow change happening along it. They'd made calls. There would have been a figure discussed. A negotiation. A pause. That is the only kind of value my world has ever assigned to a person. What they're worth in a transaction. Leora said nothing. She had learned, in the hours of their acquaintance that mattered, that his silences were not endings. They were load-bearing. You had to let them hold the weight before he could continue. My father built something real, he said. Before it became what it became. He had a reason for it, at the beginning. I used to believe that. The horizon was turning amber at its edge, barely perceptible. When he died and I stepped in, I told myself I was protecting what he'd built. That the coldness was strategy, the distance was protection, that none of it was. He stopped. A precise stop, controlled, the stop of a man who has identified the edge of what he intended to say and is deciding whether to cross it. He crossed it. I have not let anyone close to me since I was 18 years old, he said. Not because I decided not to. Because I stopped believing it was available. You make that decision long enough, you stop experiencing it as a decision. He turned his head and looked at her directly, the way he rarely did. Not the assessing look, not the measuring look, but something unmediated. I don't know who I am without the thing I built around myself. I'm not sure there's anything left underneath it. The dawn was coming up properly now, the light going from amber to gold, the rock formation around them acquiring color and definition. In it, she could see him clearly, the cut above his eye, the exhaustion that had moved past physical into something deeper, the face of a man who had just said the truest thing he had said in 15 years and was sitting with the exposure of it, not asking to be rescued from it. She didn't offer him comfort. She had never been built for comfort as a delivery mechanism. She was too honest for the softness it required, and he was too perceptive to receive it without seeing through it, and neither of those things would have served him. What she offered instead was the thing she actually had. I want to tell you what I see, she said. Not what I thought I saw 2 years ago. Not the file, not the reputation, not the mask. She held his gaze with the steadiness she'd used to hold every difficult thing in the past 4 days. I see a man who gave me his last layer of warmth and then sat in the cold and didn't mention it. A man who stood watch all night so I could sleep, who put himself between me and the patrol so I'd have time to get to cover. She paused. A man who, when the plane was going down, looked exactly as frightened as I did. Not more. Not differently. The same. Another pause. That is not a man with nothing underneath. That is the only version of a person worth knowing. The silence that followed was not like the others. It had no management in it. No distance. He looked at her for a long time. The gold light was fully on them now, warm in a way the desert had not been warm since the first terrible afternoon, and in it his expression was not controlled and was not neutral and was not any of the things she had catalogued across 2 years of sitting in the same rooms as him. When he moved it was not fast. It was the opposite of fast, deliberate, considered, the movement of a man making a decision he intended to stand behind. His hand came up and found the side of her face, and he looked at her for one more moment as if confirming something, and then he kissed her. Not gently. Not tentatively. With the full weight of someone who had been without water for a very long time and had just been told that what was in front of them was real and drinkable and theirs. It tasted of exhaustion and desert salt and something that had been locked behind 15 years of careful construction and was now finally out. She kissed him back with everything she had. Which turned out to be more than she'd known was there. When they stopped, she was still close. Close enough that his forehead came down to rest against hers and they stayed like that, breathing the same air, while the desert morning arrived around them as if nothing significant had happened, as if the world was exactly the same as it had been an hour ago. It was not the same. Not even slightly. Neither of them said so. Neither of them needed to. The helicopter found them 3 hours later. She heard it before she saw it, the mechanical rhythm cutting through the desert silence, familiar and impossible at the same time, the sound of the world they had left reasserting itself from above. They moved into open ground and she used the lighter on the last of the dry brush she was carrying, a small fast fire that produced more smoke than flame, and she stood beside it and watched the helicopter bank and circle and descend with the feeling of someone watching something end. Not everything. Not the thing that mattered. But something. The medics were efficient and professional and spoke 3 languages between them and treated Yun's arm with the focused urgency of people who understood what 4 days without proper care in 40-degree heat could do to an infected wound. They treated Leora's ribs and her wrist and the laceration above her eyebrow that had opened and closed and opened again across 5 days of being ignored. There were blankets, water that came in a sealed bottle, nutrition that arrived in a form that tasted of nothing and was the best thing she had eaten in recent memory. She sat with the foil blanket around her shoulders and drank the water slowly, the way she'd taught herself in the desert, and watched the landscape below them recede through the window as the helicopter climbed. Yoon sat across from her. His arm was bandaged properly now, his face cleaned, a medical dressing above his eye. He looked like himself again, the external version, the assembled version, except that she had seen underneath it now and could not unsee it, and when his eyes found hers across the cabin she understood from his expression that the same was true in the other direction. The hospital in Casablanca was private and very good and full of people who had been notified of their survival and had immediately begun managing it. There were calls to be made. Statements to be prepared. Legal representatives arrived within 2 hours of landing, moving through the corridors with the practiced urgency of people who understood that the first 48 hours of any public incident were the ones that determined the shape of everything that followed. She was given a room and clean clothes and a phone and was told, with professional courtesy, that a communications team was available to assist her in coordinating with the press. She thanked them and closed the door and sat on the edge of the bed in the first private silence she'd had in 5 days. She thought about the desert. About the dune and the water lens and the sandstorm and the cold. About a man's voice saying 19, in the tone of someone reporting from behind thick glass, and the hand still on his arm afterward. About a rock formation at dawn and forehead against forehead and the decision, mutual and unmistakable, to stop pretending that the distance was still available. She didn't know what the real world would make of it. She knew what the real world tended to make of things, which was a negotiable version of what had actually happened, reshaped to fit whatever existing story was most convenient. She was not interested in the negotiable version. She found out what Yoon had done when her phone began receiving messages in the late afternoon. Her contacts, people she hadn't spoken to in 5 days, sending her the same link in quick succession. She opened it. He had walked out of the hospital an hour earlier. The press had been waiting. They had been waiting since the story broke, the kind of waiting that produces footage whether you engage with it or not, and he had stopped in front of them instead of moving through them. He had looked at the cameras with the steady, absolute self-possession she recognized as native to him, not performed, just his, and he had spoken clearly and without a written statement. He said her name first. He said what she had done, the water, the storm, the camp, the rescue operation she had engineered alone in the dark with one lighter and her knowledge of how dunes fail. He said it in full and on record with the specificity of someone who intended it to be documented accurately. And then he said the rest of it. The part that made his organization go quiet in the particular way that organizations go quiet when they are recalculating. The part that his lieutenants would later describe, in the careful language of people managing a problem, as a significant liability. He said, "She is not a colleague." He said it in the way that made the alternative clear to anyone listening. She watched it twice. Then she put the phone down and looked at the wall for a while. There was a knock at her door 20 minutes later. She opened it. He was still in the clothes the hospital had provided, the dressing above his eye very white against his face, and he looked at her the way he had looked at her in the desert. Not the managed look, not the calculating look, the other one, the one she had only learned existed 5 days ago and could now not imagine having missed. His lieutenants came the following morning. She sat in the corner of the room and listened while they laid out the case for damage control, for statements, for the narrative management of what he'd said on camera. He listened to all of it with the patience of a man who had already made his decision and was extending the courtesy of hearing the argument against it before he said so. When they finished he said, "No." They said, "This is a vulnerability. The organization." He said, "I know what it is." I said no. They left. The room was quiet. Outside the window Casablanca was doing what cities do, continuous, indifferent, unaware that anything had changed. He sat down across from her. She looked at him. "What happens to the organization?" she asked. "It continues or it doesn't. Under different management if necessary." He looked at his hands, then back at her. "I spent 15 years building something I didn't choose. I'm not interested in spending the next 15 defending it." She considered this. "You don't know what you're building instead." "No." Something moved at the edge of his expression. "But it's the first time I've been in that position by choice." She looked at him for a long moment. Outside, the city moved through its ordinary afternoon. In here there was just the two of them and the quiet and the beginning of something that had no name yet, no structure, no strategy, no 15-year plan. Nothing like an empire. Nothing like anything either of them had operated inside before. It felt, she thought, like the first honest thing. "All right," she said. He looked at her. "All right," she said again, and this time it meant something more than the word, and he understood it, and the quiet between them settled into the particular quality she had first noticed in the desert. Not empty, not managed, but full of something real. They stayed there while the afternoon went on without them, and for the first time in longer than either of them could clearly remember, that was enough. They never gave the interview. Every major publication asked, most of them more than once, and the requests came packaged in increasingly creative framings. An intimate profile, a survival retrospective, a piece about resilience and leadership and the human capacity for endurance under extreme conditions. Leora declined them all with the same brevity she applied to everything she didn't want to do. Yoon didn't decline them. He simply never responded, which in his world had always been its own complete answer. The story the press constructed without their participation was dramatic and largely inaccurate and satisfied the audience that needed it. Let it. The real story lived in quieter places and belonged to no one else. It lived in the way Yoon now asked instead of instructed. A change so subtle that most people around him didn't consciously register it, but which altered the entire texture of every room he walked into. He had always known how to direct people. He was learning, slowly and with the particular difficulty of someone rewiring a reflex rather than acquiring a new skill, how to include them. Leora watched it happen without commenting on it, which was the most useful thing she could offer. He didn't need commentary. He needed space to practice without an audience, and she gave him that by treating it as ordinary, which was its own form of generosity. It lived in the way she accepted help without processing it as a loss. This was harder than it sounded. The pride that had kept her functional and self-sufficient through years of operating in difficult environments did not retire gracefully. It required ongoing negotiation, a daily recalibration of the distinction between self-reliance as a genuine strength and self-reliance as a reflex that had outlasted its usefulness. She was better at it than she'd been. She was not finished getting better at it. She suspected she wouldn't be for a long time, and had made a separate peace with that. The desert had been a pitiless teacher because it had no interest in their comfort. It had not engineered their circumstances to instruct them. It had simply been what it was, completely and without modification, and they had either learned from it or they hadn't. What it taught Leora was that the pride which saves you in ordinary life will kill you in the extraordinary one. That trusting someone is not the same as surrendering to them. That the wall you build to keep danger out eventually becomes the thing keeping everything else out too, and you don't notice when that happens because from the inside a wall looks the same in both directions. What it taught Yoon was that control is not the same as safety. That the people most worth protecting are the ones you allow to see you, not the ones you keep at managed distance behind the glass. That a man can build an empire and live inside it like a prisoner and never once identify the bars, because the bars were built from the inside and carry no lock that anyone else can see. The desert had taken his infrastructure, his authority, his carefully constructed environment of total control, and replaced it with sand and heat and a woman who was completely unimpressed by all three, and something in that replacement had been, against all probability, the most clarifying experience of his adult life. It taught them both the same deepest lesson, arriving from different angles. That the version of a person you construct before you know them is not knowledge. It is a story you tell yourself for the convenience of not having to look. And the truth, when you finally look at it, when the crash strips away every performance and leaves only what is actually there, the truth is almost always more complicated and more worth having than the story was. What they built together was small by the only measure Yun's previous life had used. No empire. No infrastructure of the kind that required security details and carefully managed public narratives. An office with good light and a coffee machine that worked reliably, which Leora had specified as a non-negotiable condition of the lease. Work that was genuinely theirs, the kind that asked something real of both of them and gave something real back. People around them who were trusted because they had earned it and knew they could lose it, which was a different kind of organization than the one Yoon had run before and a healthier one in ways that were difficult to quantify but immediately legible to everyone inside it. Most evenings ended with the two of them at the long table by the window, work spread between them, the city doing its usual thing outside. Tired in the particular way that honest work makes you tired. Not hollowed out, not performing the aftermath of a day spent managing appearances, but genuinely spent, used up by something that had required them fully and received them fully. At peace in the way that nothing manufactured quite manages to replicate. They didn't talk about the desert often. It had become the thing that certain silences between them referred to without requiring words, a shared coordinate, a fixed point they both knew the location of. The desert had not been kind to them. Kindness had not been available in that environment and would not have served them if it had been. What the desert had been was honest. It had taken everything that wasn't load-bearing, every title, every wall, every performance, every constructed distance, and it had shown them what remained underneath all of it. What remained, it turned out, was enough. More than enough. It was, in the end, everything.